courts have given some very important judgments over the years since the Human Rights Act came into force. I think particularly of the A case, the case concerning the detention of foreign nationals who are suspected of being prisoners. I think it was quite outrageous that the government ever thought it could get away with interning people effectively without trial for lengthy periods of time. And the Human Rights Act was what allowed our Supreme Court, our House of Lords as it then was, to make the point that that was completely unjust, unfair, and Parliament's sovereignty being respected by the Human Rights Act. The House of Lords couldn't overrule, couldn't strike down this legislation, but Parliament acted on that. And that seems to me to be the way that a human rights instrument should work. It should be part of law, it should allow the courts to balance the interests of the individual against the interests of society, but it should ultimately allow Parliament to decide whether to follow the court's lead or not. That's what our Human Rights Act does. It works very well. It's such a terrible shame that it isn't properly understood by people in this country for what it is. A very important set of benchmarks, which is fundamentally important if you're going to have a legal system that's operating properly. It's something Liberty is doing its best to try and deal with.
What worries me about this whole debate or this proposal to do away with Human Rights Act is the timing of it. Because it's coming at a time of great economic downturn. There are lots of people who are very unhappy, and there are lots of people who are hurting at the moment. And then we don't have a policy, or we don't have any, we can't foresee things getting better. And I think that is what worries me. And if this economic situation continues, there will be more people on the streets, there will be more protests, there will be more people who come out and say, we want an answer to the problems that we are facing. And therefore, this context, the timing of it, is really worrying, because why is Human Rights Act being removed now? Because then perhaps, we don't know, the government has a free hand to deal with any kind of dissent in the country, whatever shape or form it may take. And that's something to think about and to watch out for.
Going back to Dale's point, Youssef, do you think that it's an issue of media spin? Does media come into it, the way that it's being portrayed?
Certain parts of the media, of course, the Telegraph and Daily Mail, etc. With the Human Rights Act, I think what needs to be tightened is the abuse of it. Cases like Radha, for example, yes, he deserves justice and everything else, but for the case to drag on across so many courts for so long, at a great cost to the taxpayer, I think that should be dealt with and tackled, and that's my comment on the issue.
Can I come back on this? I mean, what was at stake in the Abu Qatada case was basically torture, which I hope we would all agree is something which is fundamentally wrong, obscene. And just as we wouldn't torture people in this country, I don't think we should send people to other jurisdictions where they might be tortured. Now, the case took a long time because cases, the way the law works is it has to go up through the system from different level to different level. Each court has to express its view, and with the system we now have, then a case may go on to the European Court of Human Rights. It is clearly regrettable that it took a long time, but I don't think actually for what was achieved in that time, it actually did. I mean, the case made its way, as cases do, through the courts. But it was important that it did so, because what was at stake is torture. Firstly, whether it was safe to remove him to Jordan, whether he'd be at risk of torture there. And actually, what happened in that was the government was ultimately successful. It managed to persuade the courts in this country and the Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg that actually they had reached sufficient agreements with Jordan to protect Abu Qatada when he was returned there. But torture still came to the fore, because the second issue that had to be considered by the courts was whether it was right that if he was removed to Jordan, he could be convicted on the basis of evidence which had been obtained from other people under torture. Now, we, to our great honour in this country, abolished torture in the 17th century, and we established the principle that torture evidence obtained from torture, should never, ever be admissible at admissible in criminal proceedings. So all the Court of Human Rights was about doing was applying that principle to another country, saying, just as we wouldn't in Europe expect ever to convict somebody on the basis of evidence obtained from other people under torture, so we can't return them to countries where that will happen. And that is all part of putting a very clear line in the sand. Torture in all forms is always completely abhorrent and should never be allowed. And the Court of Human Rights was establishing that principle. It is allowing the government to go back to Jordan and try and sort the matter out. If the government can get sufficient guarantees from Jordan that Abu Qatada will not be convicted on the basis of evidence obtained by torture from others, then it is very likely that he will go back there. I think we'll probably be glad to see the back of him, but I think it is also very important that we abide by the principle that torture can never ever be justified and torture evidence can never ever be used.
I note on Twitter that a lot of the members of the audience are agreeing with our panel. That's why I'm glad to see that the abolition of torture leads to the agreement of the majority of the people here.
I think I'd like to tie in 2 points that were made by previous speakers, Radha and James, which is this, what James was just saying there about that this was the court enforcing British principle, which was not using torture. I think if you tie that in with what Radha said about that a lot of people are hurting at the moment because of the economic crisis, and tie that in with what I said about the media sensationalism over a single case like Abu Qatada, and the stories around that about his 5-bedroom house in Wembley and his £100,000 a day security bill and all the rest of it. I think when you tie that in with the pain and suffering that some people are feeling in the country, or at least feel like they're feeling in the country, makes it very difficult to then rationalise the debate around the ECHR. And I think it's easy for people to confuse the ECHR with Europe, like I said earlier, probably through ignorance, whether that's their own fault or not, is down to your interpretation. I think in terms of access to information, there is also another issue here, which is that actually I think the public are suffering a bit from information overload. So for those of them that are proactive in the press and doing research, etc., those of us that are on Twitter, there's so much content being delivered all the time, it's really difficult to ascertain what's what. I think it's easy when two words have European in them to then confuse that. And I think Radha's point about the pain that people are feeling is really succinct to this, actually, is this: why can't we deport somebody, which is how people see it, why can't we deport somebody who is probably a terrorist? That's how people, when you strip it away, that's the essentiality behind it. And I think it's really difficult for people to put it into perspective that this is, at the end of the day, enforcing a British principle of not using torture.
If you read the very last chapter of George Orwell's Hamil, George Orwell obviously was an interesting man, you know. He went eating, didn't he? And when anybody became a socialist, went and fought for the socialist side in the Spanish Civil War, was wounded. And the last chapter he returns, and the train has come up through Sussex, and he talks about the milk is still, you know, it's the sort of the bucolic tranquility of England. You know, the fact that people are here, that they're living in a country where the police are not going to smash down their door, that there's no war, that they can expect certain things regardless, you know. And he has just come from a country which is not that far away, which is going through an absolutely savage conflagration, which was the forerunner to the Second World War. Anyway, the point that he makes is Britain is close, but it's far away, and it didn't see within this wonderful, you know, the wonderful evolution of civil liberties in Britain that existed even in the 20s and the 30s. There was this extraordinary complacency and a failure to recognise that what was going on the continent was going to affect it, and that it was in its interest to be an active partner in the European continent to just, you know, to try to set some universal standards. And of course we know what happened. We had, you know, the rise of fascism, the disaster of the Second World War, and, you know, the European Union was born out of that. You know, it was an economic project to have a single market, but it was fundamentally a political project to prevent. You know, there had been three major wars. There had been the Second World War, the First World War. The Prussians had invaded the French in 1870. And I think we've got the same thing now. You know, I mean, I've made my life in England, and I do believe it's a great country. It's a great place to live. I think London is fantastic. The universalism of it, etc., etc. But it does suffer from a certain insularity which we see here. And I just think that, again, the memory is so short. I mean, Britain has benefited from being in the European Union. That's why Britain joined the original European Economic Community. And what Britain, and as Jay's pointed out, I mean, British civil servants framed the original legal framework. And instead of talking about pulling out, they should be talking about getting more actively engaged. They should be talking about developing the human rights law in Europe and forcing places like Italy, you know, to implement it more aggressively. And I just think it's depressing, because it seems like we're going back to some kind of 30s isolationism. And I think it's very, very dangerous.
Right, well, it's always nice to end on a poetic note, so I think that with reference to literature, we should probably wrap things up. Unfortunately, we've overrun by about 20 minutes, but that's okay. If you could please join me in thanking our panellists for coming today. It's been a very interesting discussion. And thank you for all of you who have turned up and attended, and especially for those who have tweeted. I'm glad to see that it's elicited a response from our audience. You can always have a look at our website to see what the upcoming events are. And don't forget, we have a monthly podcast. The upcoming one is on the presumption of innocence, which you'll be able to listen to on our website. So we have a drinks reception in the back, in the foyer, so please do join us for a few drinks, and if you have time to mingle with us. Thanks.